It's one thing to imagine like the relief, of finding out what happened to a loved one who's been missing
Uh-huh.
for years. But what if that answer just like digs up even more questions? That's
Yeah.
that's the strange situation facing the family of Deanna Patnode,
Mm.
a young woman from Minnesota. Her case has more twists and turns than a back road in the mountains,
Hmm.
and we're going to try and make some sense of it all today.
Yeah, Deanna's story starts back in 1982, when she vanished. Years went by. And then in 1989, some mushroom hunters made a grim discovery in the woods off Highway 61, skeletal remains. It wasn't until much later, thanks to a deck of cold case playing cards and a very persistent detective, that we even knew who those remains belonged to.
That's right, a deck of playing cards.
Yeah.
Each card featured a different cold case, and they were distributed in prisons, in the hope that someone might recognize a face or have some information.
It was a long shot, but sometimes those are the shots that pay off. And in this case, it did. An inmate recognized Deanna from the 4 of Diamonds card and remembered her as a neighbor who disappeared. That tip led investigators to Deanna's sister, Chloe, and DNA testing confirmed the match.
So after all those years, they finally had a name to go with the bones. But did that answer any of the big questions, like how Deanna died?
It actually helped them figure that out. Initially, the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death because of the condition of the remains, but once they knew it was Deanna, and they had more information about the circumstances of her disappearance, they were able to rule it a homicide.
So someone took Deanna's life. Do we have any idea who?
That's where things get really murky. It turns out there was never a missing persons report filed for Deanna. It seems that back then, things were handled differently, and since she was an adult, her family might have thought she'd turn up eventually.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for investigators, trying to solve a decades-old case without even knowing for sure when the person went missing. How do you even begin to retrace someone's steps without a starting point?
It was like working with a puzzle missing half its pieces. They had to rely on the fading memories of friends and family to try and piece together Deanna's last known movements. According to what they could gather, Deanna was last seen leaving a bar called the Buckboard Bar in South St. Paul with an unidentified man on October 26, 1982.
So they had a location, a date, and a potential witness. Someone who might have been the last person to see Deanna alive. Did anyone remember what this man looked like?
Sadly, no. After nearly 30 years, memories had faded, and there was no description available, not even basic details like height or build.
So, a dead end. They knew Deanna was last seen with this man, but they had absolutely no way to track him down. It's like he just vanished into thin air.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, Deanna's body was found miles away from where she was last seen. Remember, her remains were discovered in Wabasha County, but she was last seen in South St. Paul, a distance of roughly 80 miles.
So was she driven all that way? And by whom? Someone she knew, or a complete stranger.
Those are the questions that keep investigators up at night. The distance suggests that someone intentionally took Deanna's body to that location, perhaps because it was secluded and they thought it wouldn't be found.
Okay, so potentially someone familiar with the area. And then, years later, they get a call about a convicted murderer named Donald Bloom.
Right. A relative of Bloom's contacted the sheriff's office claiming Bloom lived in Deanna's neighborhood when she disappeared. It was a potential link, but it wasn't fully investigated at the time.
Why not? It seems like a pretty crucial lead.
It wasn't until years later that Chief Deputy Warren, the detective who initially found Deanna's remains in the evidence room, decided to revisit the case and that lead. He discovered Bloom had been transferred to a prison in Minnesota.
Finally, a promising lead. Did Warren get to interview Blum?
Unfortunately, no. In a cruel twist of fate, Bloom died in prison just days before the interview could take place. Talk about a frustrating near miss.
It's heartbreaking to be so close to a potential breakthrough and have it slip away like that.
Yeah.
What did Warren do next? Did he give up on the case?
Not at all. Warren was incredibly dedicated to finding out what happened to Deanna. He decided to shift his focus to interviewing people who knew Bloom, hoping to uncover any connections or details that might shed some light on Deanna's disappearance. He wasn't going to let this case go cold again.
So we have a young woman who disappears. No missing person report is filed, and her remains are found miles away in a secluded spot years later. It just screams, something's not right, doesn't it? Was there anything about Deanna's life that might help explain what happened?
Well, based on the information gathered from friends and family, Deanna lived a pretty ordinary life. Grew up in Inver Grove Heights, went to Simley High School, enjoyed hanging out with her loved ones. There's nothing to suggest she was involved in anything risky or dangerous.
So no obvious reason why someone would target her.
Not that we know of. The deeper investigators dig into Deanna's life, the more this case seems to defy easy explanations.
What about the Buckboard Bar? Did anything
Yeah.
about that location stand out to investigators? Was it in a rough part of town, known for any illegal activity?
Not particularly. It was just a regular neighborhood bar, the kind of place where people would go after work to unwind or catch up with friends. Investigators interviewed a lot of the bar's regulars, but no one seemed to have any concrete information about Deanna or the man she left with.
It's almost as if she stepped out of that bar and into a void, vanished without a trace.
That's a pretty accurate description of how this case feels. The lack of a missing person report, the faded memories, the distance between where she was last seen and where her remains were found, it all makes this a tough puzzle to solve.
Let's go back to those cold case playing cards for a moment. That seems like such an out-of-the-box idea. Where did that even come from?
It was the brainchild of a Minnesota state representative who got inspired by a similar program in Florida. The idea was to get information about these unsolved cases out to a wider audience, particularly people who might be incarcerated and might have crossed paths with the perpetrator.
It's like tapping into a whole network of potential informants. People who might have heard something or seen something that seemed insignificant at the time.
Exactly. And in Deanna's case, it worked. That tip from the inmate who recognized her photo was the break investigators needed. It just goes to show you that sometimes the most creative approaches are the ones that yield the best results.
So the playing cards helped put Deanna's case back on the map, so to speak. But even with the DNA match and the homicide ruling, we still have so many unanswered questions. What are your thoughts on what could have happened to Deanna that night?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have to consider all the possibilities. Was she abducted? Did she willingly leave with this man, someone she knew? Or was this a random encounter that turned tragic? Was she targeted? Or was this a crime of opportunity? Without more information, it's really hard to say.
And the fact that her remains were found so far away from the Buckboard Bar, does that tell us anything about the person who might be responsible?
It definitely raises some interesting points. That 80-mile distance seems to indicate some level of planning and forethought. Whoever moved Deanna's body to that location likely knew the area, perhaps choosing it because it was secluded and less likely to be discovered.
So maybe someone local to Wabasha County, or at least someone familiar enough with that area to know where to hide a body. Which brings us back to Donald Bloom.
Right. Even though we can't definitively say whether Bloom had anything to do with Deanna's disappearance, the timing and the geographical connection are hard to ignore. He lived in her neighborhood when she vanished, and years later, he dies just days before investigators can question him. It feels like an almost impossibly bad break for the investigation.
It's as if the pieces were just starting to come together, only to be scattered by Bloom's death. Do you think there's still any hope of finding answers through that connection, even with Bloom gone?
It's definitely a tougher road, but it's not impossible. Remember, Warren decided to focus on interviewing those who knew Bloom. Someone out there might have a piece of information that seemed unimportant at the time, but could now be crucial.
Like what? What kind of information would be helpful?
Maybe someone remembers seeing Bloom around the Buckboard Bar, or perhaps they overheard him talking about Deanna. Even something seemingly small, like remembering Bloom owning a vehicle that could have been used to transport a body, could be a significant lead.
So even though Bloom's gone, his life, his connections, his past could still hold the key to unlocking this mystery. It's like trying to build a bridge across a chasm using tiny little stones.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the incredible tenacity of investigators like Warren. They have to be creative, resourceful, and willing to follow every thread, no matter how thin it might seem.
What about public awareness? Do you think the attention that Deanna's case received after the playing card tip might have spurred any new leads?
It's certainly possible. When a case gets back into the spotlight, it jogs people's memories. Someone might see a news report or read an article and suddenly recall something they hadn't thought about in years.
Maybe a detail about someone they knew, or something they saw that didn't seem important at the time. It's amazing how the human memory works. Sometimes, all it takes is the right trigger to unlock a long-forgotten piece of information.
Exactly. And in a case like Deanna's, where we're dealing with decades-old memories, any new piece of information could be the missing link.
So even though years have passed and leads have gone cold, it's still possible that someone out there knows something that could crack this case wide open. What do you think it would take to finally get those answers? To finally bring Deanna's story to a close? It seems like the more we learn about Deanna's case, the more questions we have. It's like one of those mystery novels where just when you think you've figured it out, a new twist throws everything into question.
That's what makes these cold cases so compelling, but also so frustrating. There's always that nagging feeling that the answer is out there somewhere, just waiting to be discovered.
So let's play detective for a moment. If you were leading this investigation, what would you focus on? Where would you look for that missing piece of the puzzle?
Honestly, I'd go back to the buckboard bar. That's where everything seems to hinge. Someone, somewhere, must remember something about that night. Maybe they saw Deanna arguing with someone. Or maybe they noticed something unusual about the man she left with. Even a tiny detail could make a huge difference.
It's amazing to think that some seemingly insignificant memory tucked away in someone's mind for all these years could be the key to solving this whole thing.
That's the thing about cold cases. You never know where that crucial piece of information might come from. It could be a bartender who remembers overhearing a snippet of conversation, or a patron who noticed something odd about a car in the parking lot.
So if you're out there listening to this, and you were at the Buckboard Bar on October 26, 1982, rack your brain. Think back to that night. Did you see Deanna? Did you see who she was with? Did anything, no matter how small, stand out to you?
You might think your memory is insignificant, but it could be the missing link that investigators are looking for. Don't discount anything. Every detail matters.
What about the Donald Bloom angle? Do you think there's any chance of finding a connection there, even though he's passed away?
I think it's worth pursuing. People who knew Bloom might remember things he said or did that seemed harmless at the time, but now take on a new significance. Maybe he talked about Deanna. Or maybe someone remembers him acting strangely around the time she disappeared.
It's like those old photos where you suddenly notice something in the background that you never saw before. It was always there, but you just weren't looking for it.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about perspective. With fresh eyes, and with the knowledge of what happened to Deanna, someone might see those old memories in a whole new light.
So even though Bloom is gone, his life, his connections, the things he said and did, could still hold valuable clues. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
But sometimes you get lucky and that needle shines a little brighter than the hay around it.
Exactly. And that's why investigators like Chief Deputy Warren are so important. They don't give up. They keep digging, they keep asking questions, they keep following every thread, even when it seems like there's nowhere left to go.
Because sometimes
Yes,
all it takes is that one tiny thread to unravel the whole mystery.
that's right. And for Deanna's sake, for her family's sake, let's hope that thread appears soon.
So to our listeners, if you have any information at all about Deanna Patnode, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, please contact the Wabasha County Sheriff's Office. Your tip could be the key to finally bringing justice for Deanna and giving her family the answers they've been searching for so long.
It might seem like a long shot, but every tip, every piece of information brings us closer to the truth. And in a case like this, where time has passed and memories have faded, every voice matters.
Deanna Patnode's story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when hope seems lost, there's always a chance for justice to prevail. And sometimes, all it takes is one person, one memory, one tiny detail to make all the difference.
So please, if you know something, say something. Don't let Deanna's story be forgotten. Help us bring her home.